Well, the problem comes back to central banks themselves. It seems that most people think that they're part of the cosmic firmament, but they're a fairly recent innovation. For most countries, they've only been around 100 years, and they're a complete disaster from the point of view of these idiots are responsible for printing gigantic amounts of currency units, which is to say, they're responsible for retail price rises, huge distortions in the economy. And over the last 20 years, things have really gotten out of control. This is a long-term trend. It started 100 years ago. But over the last 20 years, it's gotten completely out of control, where they've gone to ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. I thought it was metaphysically impossible for interest rates to go below zero, but they did. For a significant period of time. But now interest rates are going to be heading up regardless of what they say or do for reasons we could talk about. They've gone to massive quantitative easing, printing up trillions of currency units. This is to maintain the house of cards that we've built up over decades and decades. And getting back to your actual question about central bank digital currencies, this is like the final arrow in their quiver, where not only won't we have paper money, which is at least private and discreet, everything is going to go through your computer. Everything is going to be monitored. They'll be in a position to credit and debit your account, especially whether or not you're a good little lamb. The Canadian truckers last year had a taste of this, where the government basically reached into their bank accounts because it didn't like what they were doing. So if the public sheepishly accepts central bank digital currencies, we'll all be relegated. We'll be one step further towards being serfs, which we're on the way to doing right now. I mean, we drive luxury cars, we live in big houses, we fly in jet planes. How are we anything like serfs? The standard of living is gradually going down. Your personal freedoms are going down. And I guess the average person doesn't really care about it much because a quarter of the population is on Zoloft or Ritalin or Prozac. I'd say that they really ought to reform their entire method of thinking. Look, the things that made Western civilization what it is, far better and far different from any other civilization in world history, privacy is one of them. And it doesn't matter if you don't think you have nothing to hide. You have a right to hide whatever you do. And this is being washed away because you're told you have nothing to worry about. But this is just one of the pillars of civilization that are being washed away right from under us. And since money is the lifeblood of any civilization, it represents the fruit of your past work, which is congealed in your savings, and everything that you want to buy and sell and provide for others, it's all done through currencies. And when these people that run these central banks have control, total control of the currencies, which will be the case when these CBDCs go into effect, you don't own your life anymore. Of course, most people already don't because they're wage slaves. They're deeply in debt. They already have to. Most people already have to do and say and think exactly what they're told, because otherwise they won't be able to pay their mortgage. They won't be able to pay their credit card debt. They won't be able to pay their student loan debt. So it's already pretty much game over for the personal freedoms that we grew up learning to love and cherish. Well, first of all, this is a philosophical question. It's a question of what's right and what's wrong. And I would point out, is there anything wrong with tax evasion? It's your money that the government is stealing from you under a legal cover. You might recall that it was less than 100 years ago that the income tax didn't exist almost anywhere in the world. In fact, it was 100 years ago that all the governments of the world basically survived on import duties and excise taxes. Since then, we've had many, many taxes, most invasive of which is the income tax, but there'll be wealth taxes and all the rest of it. So this is a moral principle we're dealing with. It's not a question of how can we best fund the government. The question is not how to best fund the government. The question is how to defund the government. So in principle, I've got no problem with tax evasion at all. Everybody is so trapped by having to pay their mortgages, can't afford to lose their jobs, et cetera, that they'll basically do what they were told. Like during the recent COVID hysteria, doctors and nurses basically just rolled over like sheep and cows because they're all employees these days. And if you don't do what your employer tells you, you get fired, maybe you lose your license. So of course they just zip the lip and have this disaster imposed on us. It's nothing but a bad annual flu that was made into a political mechanism to further control. Look, a lot of people in the world are interested in money. Everybody's interested in money. Everybody wants more money to get the things you want. But there are a lot of people that are really interested in power. They're interested in controlling other people. In fact, I'll go so far as to say you got two kinds of people in the world. You got people that are interested in controlling the physical universe, creating things, making things, controlling things. And then you got people that are interested in controlling other people. And those are the kind of people that go into government in its various aspects. And they're dangerous, criminally oriented people. That's how I define a criminal, somebody that imposes himself on somebody else's life and property. The U.S. government thinks it controls the world. And one of the major means by which it does that is the fact that the whole world accepts U.S. dollars. In fact, the major export of the U.S. for decades has not been Boeings or wheat or things of that nature. It's been dollars. We ship dollars to the Japanese and the Germans for cars and computers and the Colombians for cocaine. They ship us those things and we ship them dollars. And those dollars are literally printed up out of nothing by the Federal Reserve. So the U.S. government doesn't want to lose its international monetary franchise, but it is going to lose it. The most recent stupid thing they did was confiscate the overseas assets of Russians. So now everybody's thinking around the world, you know what? If I use dollars or if I have assets in the U.S., this government in Washington is so out of control that they can unilaterally lock down or confiscate what I have, just as they did to the Russians.
Yep.
And this is why you're hearing talk about the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Iranians, a lot of countries, the Indonesians, they're all talking about coming up with a replacement for the dollar. And they will. The dollar has no backing except the good faith of the U.S. government. And nobody has any reason to trust the U.S. government at all at this point. Because look, the U.S. government's debt is $31 trillion and growing by someplace on the order of $1 to $2 trillion per year. So there's really nothing they can do about it at this point. Most government spending doesn't come from taxes from individuals and corporations. It comes from selling debt to the Federal Reserve, which then the U.S. government goes out and spends. I'll tell you what's going to happen is that since the U.S. dollar is a floating abstraction, and all of these governments realize that it's losing value by 5 or 10% or something on that order per year. So they don't like the idea that they have to settle their debts through New York. I mean, you think the Chinese like to pay for things with U.S. dollars? It's using their adversaries' currency. What they're going to do is go back to gold. People say, well, maybe we'll use the Chinese yuan. No, nobody trusts the Chinese and their yuan either. So, and look, the Russians and the Chinese, when they trade with each other, until recently, had to use dollars. But they don't want to use dollars, but they don't trust each other's currencies either. And why should they? They're just paper figments of their central bank's imagination. The whole world is going to go. The whole world is going to go back to gold, Danielle. That's what's going to happen. Ideally, there shouldn't be a gold-backed currency. Gold is money, and it should be used as money. And I know this is going to sound outrageous to everybody listening, but the government shouldn't be in the money business, okay? That's not what the government should be doing. I mean, the purpose of the government, which is actually just an instrument of force, is to protect you from force. An army, a police force, and a court system to adjudicate disputes without resorting to force. So they shouldn't be in the money business. They're not trustworthy. The type of people who go to work for the government are innately untrustworthy. So we should just be using gold. But answer to the question is yes. I suspect that the first step on this road is going to be that the Chinese and even the Russians are going to start out with a gold-backed ruble and a gold-backed yuan. It's going to happen. And at that point, if they show themselves to be somewhat trustworthy, people are going to gravitate away from the dollar because the U.S. government is a bankrupt entity at this point. People say, well, maybe the world will go to Bitcoin. Well, maybe it will. I mean, there are certain advantages to Bitcoin as money, but I'm putting my money on gold. It does. We're heading into a major crisis. Look, for years, I've said that we're entering upon a phenomenon that I call the Greater Depression, because it's going to be much worse, much longer lasting, and much different than the unpleasantness of 1929 to 1946. And how do I feel about gold? Look, I've been saying for the last several years, it's going up, but it's money, okay? So you ought to treat it as a savings vehicle, not as a speculative vehicle. And I've consistently bought gold for many, many years, and I've never sold a single ounce. So I've been buying it since about $40, and now it's about, $1,900. So I feel better having saved in gold than in dollars, but sometimes it's a good speculation. But right now, it's kind of reasonably priced relative to everything else in the world, relative to a suit of clothes, relative to a meal. You go back historically, gold's kind of reasonably priced. But I still think it's going to go up because I think that we're on the edge of a panic. And when a real panic hits, people like to hold money that is tangible in their own hand, not the promise of some bankrupt government or bankrupt central bank. So that's why I think gold's going higher. Reasonably priced at this point, but it's going higher. Because the main way that governments all over the world can finance themselves is not by taxes, it's by printing money. So when they print money, that is the cause of inflation. It's not the butcher or the baker or the gasoline maker that causes inflation. They're just reacting to it, the excess of money printed by these central banks. So inflation is going higher. It's going a lot higher. And the only reason it won't go higher is that maybe we'll have a catastrophic deflation where there's so much debt in the world as a consequence of inflation. A lot of these companies and a lot of individuals are greatly over indebted. The economy slows down. They can't pay the debt. They default on their bonds. And what happens to that $1 billion in bonds that a company might have issued? Well, it just dies and goes to money heaven, and the $1 billion it represents disappears. Same thing when an individual goes bankrupt. We're going to see a lot of that this year and the next. So that could get out of control. You could have a catastrophic deflation, even while the government is still printing up money, trying to maintain the current structure. But I've got to tell you, I really couldn't be more bearish for all kinds of long-term reasons. I mean, the culture itself, the civilization itself, is in the process of slow motion collapse. And the financial markets are all overpriced. I mean, bonds had negative yields. Like I said, I thought that was metaphysically impossible, but I was wrong. But people forget that it was only in the early 80s that the US government was paying up to 18% to borrow money. That's going to happen again.